Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Hello, I'm Richard Reinsch. Today we're talking with Gregory Collins about his impressive new book, Commerce and Manners, in Edmund Burke's Political Economy. Gregory Collins is postdoctoral associate and lecturer in the program on ethics, politics, and economics at Yale University. Gregory, welcome to the program.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for the opportunity to talk.
Excellent. So thinking about political economy, which is the term you used throughout the book, what is Edmund Burke's political economy? And maybe also, what do you mean by political economy? I think that's worth thinking about, too. We usually just think about economics, and economics almost as a separate sphere of study, but I think you mean something more here.
Yes, that's a great question because much of my book really hinges on an appropriate understanding of what political economy meant in Burke's time and what it means today. So as you suggested, in Burke's age, statesmen, thinkers, they studied political economy, not economics. Economics today is more of a specialized, narrow field with particular quantitative methodological approaches, while in Burke's time, it was a more capacious, holistic understanding of the intersecting concerns of commercial activity, trade, both domestic and foreign, as well as the broader social, religious, ethical preconditions for commercial activity. It was in this wide sense that Burke understood and tried to study the implications of commercial activity, which included certainly particular insights into trade, taxation, revenue, but also broader considerations about the role of commerce in the wider social order.
What was his approach to political economy?
His approach was, I would characterize it as a resistance towards specialization in the broadest sense. And he used this premise to inform his understanding of commercial activity, both in regard to the free internal grain trade, which was the subject of his primary economic writing, Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, and it informed his understanding of the political economy of the French Revolution and the political economy of European civilization as a whole. So one of the core arguments in the book, I guess I'll jump to it right now, in the chapters on the French Revolution, and the great intellectual historian John Pocock, first, I believe, to recognize this in a pioneering essay he wrote on Burke's political economy of the French Revolution. Burke argued that the appearance of the modern commercial economy, the mass commercial economy of Europe, grew out of particular ethical preconditions that predated the mass commercial economy, the prior religious and social and ethical traditions that were built up throughout the ages by what he called the spirit of the gentleman and the spirit of religion. So religious establishments such as the Church of England and the hereditary aristocracy, which provided and encouraged a culture of learning, patronage, and moral and religious instruction, all furnished conditions of stability, moderation, an element of courtesy, chivalry, of course, that provided the necessary environment for commercial activity to emerge. Commercial activity which was more prone to vicissitudes, vagaries, unpredictability than the more stable orders of religion and the landed aristocracy. And so for Burke, these two pillars were essential for providing this foundation for the emergence of the mass commercial economy. If those two pillars withered away, this is part of Burke's argument in the French Revolution, then social order would decline, which for him would include commercial activity.
You note in the book this put him at odds with many Enlightenment theorists, including many in the Scottish Enlightenment, on the origins of markets and the perpetuation of markets as well.
Yes. So this is a distinctive quality of Burke with regard to his debates with other intellectuals at the time. Many of the Scots, who I happen to be fond of them, David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, Adam Ferguson actually was probably closer to Burke than the other two, but the general tenor of their understanding of markets is not that they severed markets from morality. In fact, as we know, Smith was a professor of moral philosophy, and he wrote a great book on moral philosophy. But as I outline in the book, and Pocock also mentioned this, they didn't appear to draw Burke's specific argument that commercial activity grew out of these preconditions prior to the Enlightenment. And so not only for Burke was there a necessary moral foundation for markets, this moral foundation was not a modern moral foundation. It was a pre-modern moral foundation. This is not to say that Burke elevated this sort of a romantic conception of chivalry, but he thought that the roots of commercial order could be discovered prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to the invisible hand concept, prior to the elevation of profit as a worthy human endeavor. And then, in addition, Burke, he held an interesting attitude toward the idea of the do commerce theory, which is embraced by the Scots, embraced by the French Enlightenment theorists as well, Thomas Paine famously.
What's the do commerce theory?
So the do commerce theory is the idea, and this idea persists today, that the increase in commercial relations between two parties, including two nations, tend to produce peaceful effects over time. Two trading partners, as opposed to invading one another for land or power, they will find mutual interest in trading goods and services with one another. And therefore, they have an investment in each other that would discourage them from starting a war with one another. The reasoning goes, therefore, the enhancement of commercial relations will promote peaceful relations over time. Now, Burke, he does not dismiss this. In fact, he adopts this reasoning in regard to, let's say, Ireland and England. In his most comprehensive statement on free trade, when he wrote 2 letters to merchants of Bristol, the community he was representing, that opposed the free trade measures with Ireland. Burke argued in favor of the free trade measures for many of the reasons that advocates of the do commerce theory espouse today, that they do tend to promote peaceful social relations, their mutual interest in increasing trade with one another. And he also adopts this reasoning with regard to the American colonies in his famous speeches on America. He lavishes praise on the Americans for their ingenuity, their industry, their diligence, their hard work, and their commercial undertaking. And these are 2 of the clearest instances in which Burke does embrace this idea that the increase in commercial relations will tend to promote peaceful social relations. But he does not necessarily adopt this in his broader political thought. The most glaring case was the French. There are a couple examples. The 1786 Anglo-French commercial treaty I mentioned, speech on traders' correspondence bill in the early 1790s during the French Revolutionary Wars, in which Burke pushed back against this idea that increasing commercial relations with France, both pre-revolutionary France and France during the Revolution, would not necessarily encourage peaceful relations, based on the simple idea that if you are engaging in commerce with an avowed enemy or rival, that is not a guarantee that rival will tend to adopt peaceful measures. For Burke, in that sense, commercial considerations should be subordinate to wider national aims of honor, of national interest. And how I harmonize these various strands of his thoughts on do commerce, and as has been said before, Burke was not necessarily a systematic thinker. He did not write systematic treatises mostly. So you have to piece together his different thoughts from various speeches and writings. I argue that for Burke, even the do commerce thesis, similar to his broader point about how modern commercial activity requires ethical preconditions, the do commerce thesis, especially international relations, also requires pre-economic commitments, shared values, as we would say today, shared principles, which is why he thought that free trade between England and Ireland, England and the Americans, would best reflect the spirit of do commerce. But in the case of France, which did not have shared political principles, he did not think that increased commercial activity between England and France would promote peaceful relations. And so that's the distinction I carve out in the book.
Okay. So you wouldn't say Edmund Burke was a free trader, but you also wouldn't say he was a mercantilist. You would say he is balancing he is balancing international trade or transnational trade for its good effects and good consequences, but those aren't its own justification. It has to also be balanced against national interest and the needs of the empire and what's going to best serve it, which, as I read your book, I heard you to be saying, generally Edmund Burke favored pretty liberalized trade, but he made crucial exceptions, and you've kind of articulated some of those here. In thinking about Burke's political economy, I thought we might go to the beginning of your book and think about the arcane topic of Britain's internal grain trade. You write at the beginning, because I think it's instructive in a lot of ways, you write at the beginning of chapter 2, you say, quote, Burke discerned poetry in the elusive motions of England's internal grain trade. Gregory, talk about that poetry.
Yes. The internal grain trade turned out to be one of the primary protagonists in this narrative. The internal grain trade was the subject of Burke's primary economic treatise, thoughts and details on scarcity, which really wasn't a treatise. It was a private letter written for government officials that addressed the particular circumstances of mid-1790s England, which in the middle of the French Revolutionary Wars experienced a number of difficulties, including spiking grain prices, increasing urbanization, population growth. This was only a few years before Thomas Malthus wrote his famous book it provides famous thesis on whether the food supply would be able to sustain population growth. And for Burke, however, his principal argument in this tract, Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, is that there was what I call poetry, an order to the internal grain trade of England that was delicate, that was fragile, but that nevertheless tended to work absent arbitrary meddling government intervention. And so Burke's principal message in Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, he wrote this in light of calls to intervene in increased regulations of labor contracts between employers, employees, laborers, and farmers, and impose price controls, establish new public granaries. Burke argued for government restraint. He thought that there was this order that emerged from the private contractual arrangements and interactions between farmers and laborers in the grain economy. And particularly in times of scarcity, he was very suspicious of the idea that government meddling, price controls, wage regulations could produce more beneficial consequences than if the grain trade was left to its own order. Now, this sounds like, and it is, a defense of a free market, in this case, a free domestic market. Throughout the book, I emphasize that this was sort of Burke's most comprehensive intellectual statement on free internal grain trade. He defended the internal grain trade in a number of other instances in the early 1770s and later in 1787 when there were attempts to revive bans on what we today call middlemen trading activities, forestalling, regrading, and engrossing, which are various ways in which traders would buy up provisions before they'd enter the market and then resell them at a higher price. So in these various instances, including in Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, Burke issued a robust defense of middlemen in the great economy for enabling the efficient distribution of resources, particularly to those in need. Yeah. And the other additional point is that Burke anticipated, as described in the book, F.A. Hayek's insights into the limits of rationality in coordinating complex socioeconomic activities. In Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, he does not really use the word rationalism.
So in this period that he's writing the Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, you've got a crisis, right? We've got food shortages. We've got spikes in prices. We've got people not making enough money, it seems. You've got all of these conditions. We confront those periodically in our own economy, in different ways. And he's pushing back against this from what I could read, in a way that Hayek would agree with, that Milton Friedman would largely agree with. He's emphasizing that in a time of scarcity, of seemingly economic failure, he's confronting proposals like a minimum wage. As I think about it, they wanted to have the government take over granaries. So you could think about a public option for healthcare. as an analogy. There's this desire to eliminate, as you were talking about, middlemen. But those are just people who are making money, but they're also providing an efficient way for grain to reach down market buyers. And this is an efficiency thing. So he's confronting all of this and he's saying, look, you're actually going to make the situation worse. You're going to depress the market for longer conditions. The recovery is going to take longer. It's going to be less robust, but we're not going to know what the real prices are. So all of these provisions are going to backfire, as we say. They will have unintended consequences. And I thought, you can tell us how successful he was in this regard, in this debate. But I thought that was incredibly instructive. These things continue, these battles over market failure, not taking into account government failure, policy failure. All of this Burke is confronting here in a nice, instructive way.
Yes, this moment in the 1790s was a defining moment in England's political economy, including its grain economy in the 18th century, really emerging with a more conspicuous presence when Burke entered Parliament in the 1760s. There were these periods in which there were food shortages, spikes in grain prices, instability in the grain market. This was a constant subject of Burke's concern, of legislators' concern throughout the time period. As exemplified in 1772, I should mention, when Burke led the repeal of these bans on middlemen trading activities, which were enforced, not really enforced at periods, but they're still on the books. But Burke led the repeal in Parliament of these bans, forestalling, regrading, and engrossing, on the basis of what you just said, that these regulations tend to create conditions that were even worse for participants in the agricultural economy, when in fact, in Burke's judgment, they actually facilitated the smooth efficiency of the distribution of goods and services. In fact, last semester I taught a course on constitutional law and business ethics, and one of the antitrust cases, Standard Oil case, it referenced this repeal of middlemen trading activities. It didn't mention Burke's name, but it mentioned this repeal in the early 1770s as an example in which the English grew to realize that these bans actually tended to help the operation of economic forces in the long run, as opposed to undermine them. And so Burke had an immediate impact on this debate. And yes, to your earlier comments about Hayek and Friedman, this is when Burke's free market sympathies really come out, and it could easily see Milton Friedman endorsing these arguments and Hayek as well.
I mean, Burke is developing, Hayek's famous knowledge article. He's developing those insights. Yeah. He's understanding that the market requires a lot of information that comes to you in bits and pieces. And it's the participants in the market who can make the best decision, not this comprehensive rationalist approach that is being urged upon the market.
Precisely. And he has a couple of great quotations and thoughts and details that outline that point, that individuals, legislators, magistrates, justices of the peace at that time simply did not possess the amount of knowledge necessary to regulate these employment contracts and to regulate the flow of grain with vigor and effect. And therefore, there should be great deference paid to the actual participants in the economy who are actually making decisions on whether to enter into contracts with one another, because they simply hold more wisdom, knowledge, experience about their particular conditions, which vary from person to person, from farmer to farmer, and from laborer to laborer. Now, as I mentioned in the book, I tend to be sympathetic to Burke's arguments in this case, but a couple of criticisms are necessary to mention. One, does Burke perhaps paint too positive a picture of these supposedly harmonious relations between farmers and laborers? Because there is a vast amount of literature on this particular time period and whether these contractual relations in the agricultural economy were as peaceful and harmonious and as mutually reciprocal as Burke suggests in False and Decent Scarcity. And so I mentioned a couple articles that push back against this, not Burke per se, but push back against this idea of harmonious relations between farmers and laborers. But given that, consistent with Burke's broader sort of philosophical project, he does not deny that there were hardships at the time period. What he is arguing, and what you're suggesting, is that given limited alternatives during periods of difficulty, such as scarcity, which is the best out of imperfect options? That is his main point. And his judgment in this case is that the best of imperfect options is to practice government restraint, as opposed to meddle in the internal economic activities of farmers and laborers.
Let me ask you more broadly a question, Greg. So would you say Edmund Burke, I mean, someone listening to this podcast might say, Edmund Burke, kind of a classical liberal, Lockean, market rights, small government guy, capitalism, very a good thing, can solve a lot of problems. How would you situate him broadly in the relationship between government, markets, and civil society?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And when I was writing this, I had sort of a running debate with myself about whether Burke was or was not a classical liberal. To what extent was he? To what extent was he not? Which we could probably detect from reading the book. I determine that he did overlap with elements of what we consider to be classical liberalism. And admittedly, sometimes we parse these distinctions too finely for people who are interested in ideas and carve up these distinctions, which maybe work in a classroom, but in reality, what's the actual practical difference between some of these different thinkers? But, Burke did depart from fundamental presuppositions of classical liberalism, such as Lockeanism, most famously in his criticism of the idea of a social contract as a consensual pact amongst free and independent individuals who join into society to preserve their free political natural rights. And Burke famously attacks this reasoning in Reflections on the Revolution in France, which, when he was criticizing the French Revolution for really embracing this and corrupting this idea of natural rights. I don't think, even given Burke's free market sympathies, I don't think he was a doctrinaire classical liberal. And I think he can be most comfortably placed in this, what we call the Anglo-American common law constitutional tradition, which again overlaps with classical liberalism in some respects, but also deviates from classical liberal premises such as state of abstract state of nature, free and independent individuals. And I think this is a fair interpretation. Burke's criticism of the French Revolution rested heavily on these, what he thought were flawed premises of human beings and human nature. So the effect of this is that if Burke is, and there is a running debate about whether Burke was a conservative or liberal, and one of my motivations for writing the book, what interests me is whether Burke was, well, if Burke embraced market liberty, did that make him a liberal? Did that make him conservative? Because, of course, those political classifications weren't around at his time. But insofar as he was a conservative, let's say, his conservatism certainly embraced free markets. But what distinguished his free market sympathies with other classical liberals, I would say, and this goes back to our earlier point about the Enlightenment embrace of market capitalism and the mass commercial economy, he identified his support for free markets in this wider social religious pre-commercial, pre-Enlightenment order. And for him, as long as you preserve this order, the negative effects of commercial activity could be mitigated, could be calmed because of this deeper stabilizing presence of religious establishments, of the aristocracy, the institutions that did not necessarily rely on the price mechanism to perpetuate their existence and to provide value to society. And in this sense, this is where he departs from Hayek. I describe this later in the book, that there's certainly meaningful overlaps with both Burke and Hayek's recognition of the limits of rationalism. But I think Burke placed more recognition on the idea that there is meaningful value that is generated in society, even if it is not determined by supply and demand laws, by the competitive price mechanism, such as your religious establishments and your aristocracy. He defended the laws of primogeniture and entail, medieval inheritance laws, on the basis that these did provide stability of families from generation to generation.
Let's think about the French Revolution, too, in this regard. You write about the Edmund Burke problem. That is to say, generally in favor of markets, widespread commerce. At times, he says that, markets come from nature. They emerge from human nature. And yet he also condemns the French revolutionaries' argument that rights, abstractly understood, come from nature. And that justifies the erasure of, literally centuries of French tradition, religion, culture, law. They're going to build again. Talk about how Edmund Burke understood those things.
That is a fundamental philosophical dilemma. But in general, if something is by nature natural and anything that does not accord with that idea of nature exists, all those institutions, practices, customs illegitimate because they don't conform to nature. For Burke, as I mentioned in the first chapter, French revolutionaries, they did at moments endorse a free internal grain trade. But then they ended up meddling and imposing price controls, which was one element of the historical backdrop for Burke writing thoughts and details of Scarcity. And so Burke also endorsed a free internal grain trade. So, to what extent was Burke sympathetic to some of the revolutionaries' arguments? Also, the other historical consideration is the emergence of the physiocrats, the French economists, who embraced the idea that society should conform to nature. And therefore, they justified a free market in grain. And they were also accused of being very, very rationalistic and pushing this idea of abstract rationalism in the 18th century. So how did Burke overcome this idea that if he embraced free markets, in part because they were based on nature, but the physiocrats were embracing free markets, but they were embracing abstract rationalism, and the revolutionaries were embracing free markets to some extent, but they were overthrowing French society. But where did Burke come down on this issue? Unfortunately, Burke does not provide a sufficient answer for this, but I propose that Burke, as he mentions in Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, supply and demand laws were part of the laws of nature, which are the laws of commerce, which were the laws of nature, which ultimately were the laws of God. That's sort of the phraseology that he uses. Recognizing the finite resources in society for him was a law of nature. However, insofar as he held a conception of a law of nature, sort of a natural law in general, what he called a moral law, binding people together, this law of nature was not the end point for discussion on these issues. It could be a starting point, but it's certainly not an end point. This is so much his critique of natural rights. He never fully rejects the idea of natural rights, but what he does is question its import in these practical questions of how to actually establish and maintain political society. So if on-demand laws were part of the law of nature, to what extent, for Burke, could we integrate this idea of the law of nature within a wider framework of what is necessary to perpetuate civilization? And for him, then, you integrate this law of nature with what he considers to be the foundations of civilization, which is religion, aristocracy, learning, chivalry, this ethical code that predated the commercial economy. If you merge all these elements together, it could provide for commercial prosperity while also providing for this element of stability to cool the fluxes of commercial prosperity. And so that's how I sort of try to tease out this tension in his thought between embracing the law of nature and embracing his idea of custom and tradition. For him, they were mutually sort of symbiotic and could balance one another in a way that could both promise the fruits of material goods while also protecting against the sort of crass commercialization, commodification of civil society.
You also note, too, in the aftermath of the French Revolution, that Burke seems to, he argues, what I'm saying is coming true. You have eliminated your past, you've attempted to do that, and you want to create a market on paper money. You want to create a market heavily funded in debt, giving things to people, and look what's happening to you. The French economy is now awash in corruption, inefficiencies. I thought you wrote about that. Well, maybe talk about that, how he sees the paper money thing playing out.
Yeah, so this is one of the sort of underappreciated aspects of Burke's thought, political economy otherwise. But he provided a stinging, comprehensive rebuke of what he called the paper money despotism of the French Revolution. The French revolutionaries, they seized the property of the Gallican Church, which owned around 1/10 of the landmass, I believe, in France at that time. They were going to sell the church property to help pay down France's debt, stave off financial calamity, and shore up France's finances. And they also introduced what was first a kind of bond, but then they used it as fiat paper money called assignats. Part of my French, but I believe it's called assignats. And this paper money was distributed throughout France, and with a lack of prudence and disregard for the potential destructive consequences of paper money not backed by any sort of metal. And what ended up happening was this paper money led to the depreciation of the currency, inflation, hyperinflation, as Burke predicted, price instability, price unpredictability, a lack of distrust from participants in France's economy at the time. It led to the invasion of private property rights of French authorities, seizing grain in the countryside when farmers were hoarding grain because of this lack of regularity, the lack of consistency, the lack of predictability in these internal French markets, which in Burke's judgment were exacerbated by this worthless paper money that for him reflected both the economic improprieties of the revolutionaries and also sort of the philosophical abstractions of the French Revolution as well. The idea of paper money that could be used as a saving grace to save the French economy. And for Burke, as Burke predicted in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, he criticizes these assignats. He predicts that they are going to create hyperinflation, and that's what ended up happening. And so this is another dimension of his political economy.
Let's switch gears to India. To the India question, you write at length on this in relationship to Edmund Burke and his approach to the East India Company and its policies in India and the authority it held from the British government to operate in India. Burke initiated an impeachment of Sir Warren Hastings, who was the director of the company, the overseer of its operations in India, for many abuses, physical cruelty displayed towards Indians among them. You have a quote from Edmund Burke, the opening of his impeachment in 1788 of Warren Hastings. Quote, "The East India Company became that thing which was supposed by the Roman law so unsuitable. The same power was a traitor, the same power was a lord." End quote. Talk about that, because he sees the East India Company. It has a monopoly on trade in India. Burke says that's just because it's in this new exotic market. It should deserve a degree of protection. But then it proceeds by accumulating power to itself, accumulating the economies, local economies in India to itself, destroying them in their own internal workings and then taking them over. And then also having this sort of quasi-governmental power. And Burke opposes all of this. Maybe just give us a broader understanding of that.
So Burke did defend the East India Company Charter because he thought, especially this time, we have to remember that international trade was still a novel phenomenon. And so there was great risk in trading in foreign lands, if no other reason that there's great physical risk in trading these lands in which you held a limited amount of knowledge and experience in trading in these distant territories. So for Burke, he defended the East India Company Charter for the purpose of promoting the commercial interests of the British Empire. The problem for Burke, the East India Company, in a series of victories in 1750s and 1760s, including the Treaty of Allahabad, 1765, aggrandized the powers of the East India Company so that now they did not simply held a commercial power to trade in India, but also they acquired the powers of war and peace, revenue collection, political administration, public administration. And for Burke, this was a disastrous step that fueled the expansion of arbitrary power from the East India Company and exacerbated by Warren Hastings. For Burke, the East India Company now was not simply promoting the commercial interests of the British Empire, but they start to intrude on and regulate and dictate the flow of goods within internal Indian markets. And as I describe in the book, the company ended up establishing monopolies on these Indian markets, which for Burke bred the typical negative, disastrous consequences of monopolies, such as price controls, wage controls, the destruction of supply and demand laws, which allowed goods to reach market participants in an efficient manner. And for Burke, this was representative of the gross maladministration and misconduct of the East India Company. So for Burke, when he seeks to reform the company in 1783, and there's a great speech on Fox's East Indian Bill, he does not argue to end the company charter. This was actually different between him and Adam Smith. What he does argue is that the charter should recover its initial commercial purpose of trading for commercial aims in India, while gradually loosening its control over local Indian markets and while also being held accountable with a board in London. And for Burke, this would allow the East India Company to recover its commercial integrity while also relieving the Indians of the miseries that were encouraged by the company. And this is also reflective of his broad imperial political and economic thought, that Burke did defend the Britain. There's been a running debate about whether Burke was a defender of empire or was a critic of empire. And then, the arguments to be made on both sides. But this was representative of Burke's broad imperial political and economic thought, that the British Empire did have a right, in his judgment, due to a series of treaties and military victories against local rulers, to remain in India. But they also had the moral responsibility to act with benevolent hand, and therefore preserve the internal liberties, customs, and traditions of the Indian people. And for him, the East India Company disrupted these traditions by expanding its power over local Indian communities. I will say that he wrote a number of reports on the political economy of India. I mentioned, I discussed one report at length in the book called the Ninth Report of Select Committee. This, in many ways, was even more sort of a detached and objective analysis of the economic implications of the East India Company in India. It was written for public consumption. It has more of a neutral tone than the sort of passionate prose of Bulk and Details and Scarcity. So I found that was a surprising writing that I did not anticipate having to concentrate on, but it provides a wealth of information on that.
It seems there are similarities when it comes to the empire and how the mother country relates to the colonies. You write at length about North America and Britain's possessions and the West Indies or the Caribbean. And Burke at length seems to be defending something like free trade. He's defending it for, he says this will be good for us. It'll be good for the colonies. It will help them to continue on their course of growth. And so we should loosen restrictions on their trade. While at the same time, he does favor the Navigation Acts, which you can enlighten us on that. In my understanding, it requires them at least to sell first to the mother country and to receive goods from England also. So, and then also when it comes down to the great, debate for American independence, he defends the right of the empire to regulate internal affairs of the North American colonies, but says he really shouldn't do it. Not that often, not without a clear, overwhelming reason. And he does that, I think, not from an ideological perspective, as you note. He does it because he thinks in the circumstance, in the time, this is an approach that will yield the best results for everyone involved, including the empire.
Yeah, absolutely. And first start off by saying that I started writing the book, and scholars, everyone, a lot of people today tend to read 20th and 20th century conceptions of free trade and mercantilism, these classifications, into prior time periods when, in my research on this time period, these distinctions weren't as rigid as we make them out to be today, which is why this question about whether Burke, extends this question to Adam Smith, also, whether the extent to which they supported free trade versus mercantilist policies. Take Burke for an example. As you mentioned, he defended the Navigation Acts, which were considered the heart of mercantilism. They were the series of trade laws dating back to the 17th century, the modern laws dating back to the 17th century that restricted the flow of goods within the British Empire, the colonial goods within the British Empire. And the goods had to be in English manned crews, in English vessels. They had to go through English ports before going to foreign markets. And so this was a monopoly on the international colonial economy of the British Empire. But Burke also supported what we today consider to be free trade between England and Ireland, free trade between England and the Americans, the Americans and the Caribbean British traders as well. So as I try to explain in the book, Burke supported free trade within this context under this imperial British umbrella that was governed by the Navigation Acts. So I'll leave it to the reader to judge, to what extent does that mean he was a free trader versus a mercantilist. But, his thought shows that you could accommodate these two different strands of thought on, trade policy during that time period. Even Adam Smith himself defended the Navigation Acts, the older form of the Navigation Acts, because he has famous line, defense is of much more importance than opulence. And this actually captures Burke's ways with regard to Navigation Acts, that, yes, in some ways they restricted the flow of commerce, but they also promoted the national security interests of the British Empire. And this, people don't realize, they also promoted the commercial interests of the British Empire as well. If you have the Navigation Acts, then you are assured that the transport of commerce, transport of goods, will be on ships that won't attack you, as opposed to trading with ships of foreign enemies that may threaten the transfer of your goods and of your trade. And so there's a national security interest. There's also a commercial, economic interest in the Navigation Acts as well. Now, for Smith, Burke also thought that the later iterations of the Navigation Acts were economically counterproductive.
Here, thinking towards the end of our time, Edmund Burke and Adam Smith or Edmund Burke in the Scottish Enlightenment. And the Scottish Enlightenment would say markets provide their own internal reasons for their continuation and will guide people to participate in them successfully, peaceably, prosperously. Edmund Burke disagreed with that. We have now moved forward from that period, from that debate, and that the debate sort of continues. Who do you think was right?
I'm sympathetic to Burke's arguments. I will also say, however, that I think sometimes descriptions of Scottish Enlightenment thinkers tend to read libertarianism, a little too much libertarianism into their thought. And Smith himself praised the landed aristocracy in the Wealth of Nations War. Unlike merchants, they did not combine together to support policies, anathema to the common good. And so I think there's a tendency to read this libertarian strand into Scottish thinkers themselves. I think all of them were profound observers of this weird new phenomenon of commercial activity. I think Burke had a deeper diagnosis of and prescriptions for the preservation of commercial society, precisely because he thought that we needed to retain these pre-Enlightenment, pre-commercial pillars of social order that could tame, redirect the inquisitive impulse in modernity. But he showed, and Smith and Hume and others showed that you could accommodate these two strands, commercial prosperity and this moral element of society, which I think we can learn from today.
Gregory, thank you so much for your time. Wish you the best of success with this book, Commerce and Manners, and Edmund Burke's and Political Economy. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.